Welcome to Integral, a podcast production out of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University, exploring the question, is there a common good in our common home? I'm Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley, the director of the Bannan Institutes in the Ignatian Center, and your host for this podcast. We're coming to you from Vary Hall on the campus of Santa Clara, in the heart of Silicon Valley, California. This season of Integral, we're looking at the ways in which issues of economic justice intersect with the question of the common good. Today we'll explore the discipline of economics itself. Do classical economic models teach us to privilege our own self-interest as the most efficient means to the good? Is an economy of the common good even possible?
You know, in economics, students are often taught that the market works its wonders through selfishness. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. Those words come from the famed 18th century economist Adam Smith. He wrote that many years ago. Now there is new research exploring how this lesson shapes the way students themselves behave.
We'd want education to change the way students behave, but I'm not sure learning economics has quite the effects that professors of economics might want from students. Zarghami and Ifcher find that students tend to prioritize fairness over selfishness. But when students are taught how rational, self-interested economic actors ought to behave, something happens to the way they behave.
I don't know that people are just immediately becoming more selfish per se. It's just that they're internalizing this lesson somehow, and it's bringing out behavior that isn't necessarily for the common good.
And my concern is that we're making these strong assumptions so we can solve our models, and then, lo and behold, these assumptions actually change people's behavior.
To unpack these questions, we're joined today by John Ifcher, assistant professor in the economics department at Santa Clara and Bannan Institute scholar in the Ignatian Center. He teaches courses in microeconomics, the economics of the public sector, and the economics of poverty and income inequality. His recent work focuses on subjective well-being, social welfare programs, and the decisions people make that affect others. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk about economic justice and the common good.
Great. So let's start with a brief introduction to the field of economics. What do economists study? What kinds of questions are they seeking to answer?
Well, I am a microeconomist by training, and on some level, all microeconomic models thinking ultimately reduce down to an individual decision maker. Now, I say decision maker as if it's a person, but it could be a household, it could be a country, it could be a firm. And underlying all of our models is the assumption that this decision-making entity, which I'll just call a person, is trying to maximize their own well-being. Well, in this model of individual maximization, we make some very basic assumptions. And one of those assumptions is we assume that this decision maker is acting in their self-interest exclusively. So I'm trying to do what's best for me and not considering other people in this decision making.
Students, of course, are taught that self-interest drives economic behavior. It's a cornerstone idea of the field. Students are also taught that it's rational to behave this way. We use the phrase rational self-interest.
So in creating these models, we have to simplify. And when I say that, I mean, if we were trying to model the world in all its richness, then we couldn't solve the models. The models actually wouldn't be very useful. This very large concept or model is only useful when you make strong assumptions about how people behave. Because if you don't make these strong assumptions, you can't solve any problems with this model. And my concern is that we're making these strong assumptions so we can solve our models, and then, lo and behold, these assumptions actually change people's behavior. So what was made as a simplifying assumption, I'm concerned, actually drives students' behavior when they leave the class.
Professor Ifcher's research was recently featured on NPR.
John Ifcher, along with Homa Zarghami, conducted a series of experiments. In one, students play a common game known as the Ultimatum Game. Basically, let's say you and I have $20 and I can choose to give you a share. You only get to say yes or no. You can't negotiate. So if you agree to my division, we divide the money. If you reject my division, neither of us gets anything.
Wait a minute. So I would want something more than nothing. So wouldn't I just agree to whatever you're offering?
Precisely. So standard economic theory suggests that I should offer you $1 and keep $19 because we're both acting in our self-interest.
Meaning?
I should keep as much as possible. And you should say yes to $1 because getting $1 is better than getting nothing.
Okay.
Zarghami and Ifcher find that students asked to share $20 with a partner tend to divide it close to 50-50. In fact, studies all over the world show that people do this even when they're playing with strangers, not just among friends. They tend to prioritize fairness over selfishness. But when students are taught how rational, self-interested economic actors ought to behave, something happens to the way they behave.
I don't know that people are just immediately becoming more selfish per se. It's just that they're internalizing this lesson somehow, and it's bringing out behavior that isn't necessarily for the common good.
We think, meaning me and my co-author think, that economic instruction could lead students to draw any or all of the following conclusions. One is that people are motivated primarily by self-interest. When people act in their own self-interest, it generates good outcomes for society, that most markets are competitive, that efficiency is a very important goal for society, and lastly, redistribution always reduces efficiency. Yet, each of these either is simply an assumption or only holds given a set of reasonably strong assumptions.
So teaching the models themselves create a reality that may not presently exist as students enter your classroom.
Yeah, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They come in the class with broad life experiences. We say this is how people make decisions. We tell them this is why people make decisions this way is because we can actually solve our models, not because we think they make their decisions fully like this.
Mm-hmm.
And then they walk out of the class and say, oh, this is how people make decisions. Maybe I should make decisions like that as well.
So the models themselves are shaping outcomes.
Exactly. So the models were meant to reflect something. And now my concern is that they actually are now prescribing something. And the students are walking out with these models and then basically trying to replicate what the models say in their own behavior. The people who created the models understand that the models are just models and the assumptions are strong, but I am concerned that the students don't fully take that in.
So it becomes kind of a normative standard versus something that's trying to reflect in a predictive way. It actually becomes determinative.
Yeah. And that's one of my concerns.
Let's take a listen to a recent dialogue Professor Ifcher had with one of his microeconomics students.
And I remember just starting to feel like the message that was being sent was dangerous in terms of how much the free market could do well on its own.
That's one of my concerns because, you take that first class, you come away with maybe some of these ideas, but then when you take more advanced classes, you realize that that's all based on a large number of assumptions and the nuances of those assumptions and how that impacts the predictions.
Okay. And so do you think that this is a concern that you have with business students in general? And so they just take a little bit of econ and then they go to finish their other majors?
Yeah, I'm concerned for all the students who take economics, but I'm particularly concerned about non-econ majors.
Okay.
That they walk out very free market oriented, not realizing that the assumptions don't hold under a lot of situations. Yeah. And the support for it's probably a lot less strong than they think. Mm-hmm. When I teach introductory microeconomics, literally a dozen times or more during a quarter, I might repeat the following statement. We assume that economists or our models assume that individuals act in their own self-interest. And as I said, this is at the core of many of our models. So I'm concerned that that is becoming prescriptive. And perhaps more amazing is that in such classes, the benchmark model of competitive markets asserts that when everyone acts in their own self-interest, the outcome is efficient. So this is pretty remarkable. When you act in your own self-interest, not only does it not harm other people, but it actually improves efficiency.
Can you explain a little bit more about efficiency in an economic framework?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that has one meaning probably outside the classroom and another meaning inside an economics classroom. So, outside the classroom, I think of efficiency as meaning something good. A car is efficient when it gets more miles per gallon, or a washing machine is efficient when it uses less electricity and less water. In this way, efficiency is a just sort of general good. But that's not what we mean in the economic classroom sense, or what we mean in the case of a market. In a market, what we're saying is that we have generated all of the surplus or well-being that the market can generate. A slight set of details that maybe would be useful is that if you have something and I want to buy it from you, and you value it, let's say, at $5, and I value it at $10, then there's a lot of opportunity for us to make a trade that's going to make us both better off. Like, let's say we trade it for $7.50. Well, you get $2.50 of what we call surplus because you got $2.50 more than you value it. And I get $2.50 of surplus because I value it at $10 and I only paid $7.50 for it. So we're both made better off. And in the market, we assume that all trades are mutually beneficial for the reason I just explained. And now you can see that if we both act in our own self-interest, it's going to maximize the surplus because we'll make all the trades that are mutually beneficial.
But are there times when that kind of maximization fails, or when that competitive framework does not result in an efficient outcome?
Sure. So in general, we make this blanket initial assumption, sort of our baseline assumption, that markets are what are called competitive. And in a competitive market, things work just the way I said they do. But now imagine that there's a bystander. They're not you and they're not me. They're another person, but somehow they're affected by our trade. Maybe our trade makes pollution. Maybe our trade makes a lot of noise. Maybe our trade damages their property in some way. Well, once you add that other person who's neither the buyer nor the seller, but is affected by the transaction, then our trade can actually make them worse off.
How does the model account for that?
Well, that's the thing. We start with our baseline of a competitive market. So we make another strong assumption that there are no bystanders. So we just assume away that problem. When we assume away all those problems, then all of a sudden, self-interest leads to efficiency. So people think, oh, the goal is to be efficient. Let's be efficient. And then they don't think further, what are the implications of efficiency? And one of the implications of efficiency is that the outcome might not be just. So in the case of global climate change, the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is, we believe, heating up the planet. They're human causes to global climate change. And so we recognize that we should reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are being released into the atmosphere. So one approach would be that the government uses what's called command and control regulation. They simply put an absolute limit on how much carbon dioxide could be emitted by firms. Another option that's more market-oriented would be to impose what's called a carbon tax. And the carbon tax would increase the cost of releasing carbon into the atmosphere, thereby hopefully reducing the emission of carbon.
So kind of priming a more efficient outcome that's directed to a common good versus a self-interested good.
Yeah.
To what extent are other economists raising concerns such as this?
Yeah, so, we are certainly not the first economists who have had this thought or raised this concern, and our research builds on the work of others. To quote Robert Frank, the authors asked their subjects two questions. First, what is a fair investment in the public good? Of non-economists, 75% answered half or more of the endowment, and 25% answered all. Second, are you concerned about fairness in making your investment decisions? Almost all non-economists answered yes. Frank continues, the corresponding responses of economic graduate students were more difficult to summarize. More than 1/3 of the economists either refused to answer the question regarding what is fair or gave very complex, unquotable responses. It seems that the meaning of fairness in this context was somewhat alien for this group. Those who did respond were much more likely to say that little or no contribution was fair. In addition, the economics graduate students were about half as likely as other subjects to indicate that they were, quote unquote, concerned with fairness in making their decisions.
So what would it look like if the economic models that you're proposing and ultimately operationalizing within the economics curriculum were realized? How would our economic landscape be impacted?
Well, I want to be clear. When we redo our lesson plans, we want traditional neoclassical economists to recognize what we're teaching, that it is rigorous and holds true to the underlying models. So it's really not that we're creating new models. It's that we are making different choices in what the baseline is, in how we're explaining the models, in how much emphasis is placed on, for example, when the assumptions fail or the limits of the models. So I want to be clear that we really want to stick to the traditional models. We just want to explain them in a different way that hopefully has a different impact. Now, once we do that, our hope is that students will leave our classes and recognize, for example, that not all markets are competitive, and therefore maybe we do want a government to intervene in markets to try and improve outcomes. Or we want students to think, when I make this decision, it's going to have impacts on other people. Maybe I should take those other impacts into consideration in my decision-making as opposed to just do what's best for me. So my goal is to come up with new lessons that everyone would feel are valid, meaning I'm not in any way destroying the models, but I'm just making different choices in terms of the order in which I present things in class. I'm emphasizing what happens when the assumptions don't hold. I'm emphasizing the limits of our theoretical predictions and giving lots of examples of when they fail and what happens.
Well, I look forward to seeing the impact of this work and following closely how that might reshape economic instruction and ultimately maybe some of the framework of our markets.
Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks for listening to Integral, a Bannan Institute podcast of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University. Special thanks to Professor John Ifcher for his contribution to today's episode. Coming up next week is Catherine Murphy, Associate Professor in the Religious Studies Department at Santa Clara, who will invite us to critically examine how the Christian scriptural tradition and Catholic social teaching open up questions of economic justice and the common good in dynamic ways today. Technical direction for Integral was provided by Craig Gower and Fern Silva. Our production manager is Kaylee Erickson. Thanks to Mike Whalen for advisory and editorial support. You can find us on the web at scu.edu/integral or subscribe via iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or Podbean.